Hey guys, today I want to take a look at the damper histogram and how you can use it to adjust your setups in the game. And without much talking, without much introduction, let's take a look at the damper histogram. First of all, I've been doing Mount Panorama Bathurst in the AMG GT3. This is the first stint I did with the aggressive setup, and then I kept I started doing improvements to the setup based on this graph. And in the end, my lap time increased quite a bit. We're talking almost half a second, and in that lap is a major mistake, which I will show you later, actually. First thing, what you gotta know is that ACC has changed the amount of data we are getting from the dampers in the first place, which means from 20 hertz that we had before, the game is now saving damper movements with 200 hertz to the Motec file, which helps us a lot in actually interpreting this data, because before it resulted in every lap looking a bit different, and this data really wasn't reliable to make setup changes upon. But if we click through a couple laps here, we can already see that the whole histogram looks fairly similar throughout different laps, and before the changes were quite big. So what do we see in the damper histogram? It, as I said, collects all suspension movements throughout the lap and sorts them by speed. And the sorting is as follows. In the middle, you have the slowest movements, and towards the outsides, the movements of the suspension gets faster. And we're going from 0 millimeters per second up to, I think it's 150 or something here. And on the other axis, we can see how many of those movements actually were in a certain speed category, so to say. The graph changes if you change the categories, if you make them smaller, bigger, if you increase the overall range and all that. So there's always some interpretation that needs to happen still. But generally speaking, this looks too flat. And how do I know? If we look, oops, that is definitely the wrong one. Let me click to actually this graph right there and show that to you. This is an ideal damper histogram, and we can see that this is going, like, the center is very pronounced and it's going up to 12% of all samples are in the almost zero speed range, and then it becomes already quite a bit less, going to 6-7% in the speed ranges up to 100 millimeters per second. And also outside of that, what this graph considers low speed suspension movements, we have here high speed suspension movements, and they shouldn't happen at all from a certain speed. So this is the ideal graph we're trying to achieve. And if we take a look back now at Motec, we can see this is nowhere near as pronounced. So let's first make a little bit of an adjustment to this. We can stay with this boundary, but let's increase this to 300, something similar we had on the graph I just showed. And let's make the bins a bit wider, so the categories, that they carry more information. And then already you see the graph looks way more like the one I've just been showing you, and the graph is going up a little in the middle too. Which doesn't show us any setup changes, but if we look at my final result of setups, this looks pretty much like, something I've just been showing you in here in this screenshot, right? If we compare those, this actually looks a lot better already. So how do we get from this graph to this graph, and I swear to you it's only setup changes. So let's compare these just to give a little more comparison, so to say. So let's go back to that, not half the comparison. First thing we would notice on this is, the middle is, I think it is the biggest. We have to get really close. At worst, it's a bit shifted to the left, and we want the middle to be increased even further to make it look like that ideal graphic that we just saw. Same is true for the front right. The middle isn't pronounced, and well, it doesn't really go down left and right from that. And the rear is also not as pronounced in the middle. Here actually we have the highest bar a little bit further to the left. And the rear right, well, similar, not as extreme. So everything is a bit off from our ideal graph. So what do we have to do and what do we have to understand to make setup changes? Generally, to get the middle more pronounced, or if it is too pronounced to get it down, we can change the spring rates of the suspension. So the first thing I did is, because I want the middle to be more pronounced, is make the setup harder, right? From a rather soft one to a harder one, where the suspension has more data in that, or creates more situations where the suspension doesn't move at all. So we get the middle more pronounced. So we make everything on the car a little harder, and actually let me show you the setup comparison from the game. Here we see the aggressive setup for Bathurst in the Mercedes. Just have to make sure this is still on. And we can see the front is rather soft, while the rear looks hard, but if you compare the numbers, it's actually not. So there's some room for improvements. And if we go to the next screenshot, these are the changes that I made to the stiffness. No need to look at anything else for now. I will explain the other stuff in a different video, but it's just too much to cover at once. So just going from this to this, I think on the front it's 2 clicks or so in suspension stiffness. And on the rear, it's just the last click that we had left. And this will result in more suspension movements happening in the very, very low to no speed zone. The other thing that we then had was, and let me go back to Motec and show some lap in between. So I changed the springs, but I didn't change the dampers just yet. So let's go to a lap that I did in between. This already looks a bit better, so to say. Even on the, especially on the rear, it looks pretty much on point compared with the ideal graphic that we had at the beginning, where we're going up to 12% in the middle, and it looks fairly similar now in Motec. But there is something still not quite right when looking at the whole. It has to be in the middle, right, and the left and right sides aren't really ideal. So what does that actually tell us? If you look up here, we have a rebound and we have a bump on the right side, rebound on the left. And what we can see now, if the rebound is too high, so actually not the middle is the highest, but something left or right, then we want to have more damping in that area. So very simple. When the rebound bar is too high, we want more rebound damping to happen. So we increase the rebound damping on the front. Same is true for the front right. And for the right rear, well, maybe actually we want more bump damping, maybe less rebound damping even, because it's rather going down rather quickly. And on the right rear, we want also a little more bump damping. The rest, to me, looks about fine. We don't really have to look at all at the slow, fast speed damping, because that goes down fairly fast and looks all right to me in this scenario, so nothing to change there. So what did I do to the setup in terms of damping? Let's go to the next screenshots. There is the aggressive preset with its damping, and the rear is damped rather hard overall. And this is what I ended up with after making several changes. I might have not actually been on the aggressive setup at some point because you make so many changes, but the whole idea is, right, we said that we want more rebound damping, happening on the front. This is what we did. And in the end, we resulted with, well, what I would call a little bit more pronounced center, even though it goes up to 14 here and here and here, but we can see all around that the middle is now the most pronounced bar. And while there could still some changes be made to the bump damping on the front here and there, same for the rear, maybe a tiny bit. But you also have to always confirm on track, right? With driving, it's, well, some say, well, when the engineer says you got to drive like this is the better setup, you just have to turn it into lap time. Then there always comes the driver and says, well, this is shit now. And then there's just discussion starting. But at least on my stream, and since I'm, I don't know, 10% engineer, 90% driver, I can kind of cover both sides of the equation. And if I look at the data, I can confirm just the driving that I feel and the driving that is necessary, then look at the data and see, oh, yeah, well, feels actually like that. And make the necessary setup changes in terms of springs and dampers to get my damper histogram to look more like the one that we actually want to have. The other thing is, and I made more changes to the aerodynamic department, and maybe I just cover this right away too. So looking at the screenshots again, we have, where's the aerodynamic department? That is here. So this is what the aggressive setup comes with, and at the beginning the car felt totally oversteery. I was not confident at all, couldn't push it because I was losing the car all the time. And if we look at the front aero balance, it's 0.5, whatever that means on any car, but I changed it further to the back by lowering the rear quite drastically. Also increase, let me go back and forth a bit so you can see the changes. I'll do it 2 more times, old and new. Also lowered the right hand on the front, used a little bit more split up because I felt the car wasn't really bottoming out somewhere, so I think I gave away downforce for no reason. So I increased downforce on the front, but then to cope with all the oversteer that I had, I increased downforce on the rear a lot. So and then the whole balance changed a bit backwards. By overall, I think the change is something like 0.8% further to the back, and that already gives the car a whole lot more stability. And then I started with a whole damper histogram stuff to get the car drive in the way that we wanted again. And let's go into one more aspect, which is outside of the damper histogram, but is actually in the rake setting. Let's start with the rake. You can, I think, sorry, let's go here. You can ignore everything, basically, except for the red bar down here. And this shows the rake angle of the car. So we can see on the small straight up to turn 1 on this very lap, we can see there's always the rake angle something above 0.1, 0.2 in between, something like that. Once we hit the brakes, the rake angle changes quite a bit. It becomes higher, the rear lifts up, the front goes down. And when the corner is done, we accelerate, or I accelerate, and the rake angle shifts back. Then we have a little bump, so over bumps the angle changes all the time. And then we approach the next corners, and so on. And well, it's hard to spot anything in here. We can see there are some points where the rake becomes negative. And these start to be the interesting points, because with a negative rake, all of a sudden the aero balance changes quite a lot. And in this case, the car becomes understeery when that happens. So what I look at now, because this is kind of hard to spot, where is this happening? I prepared a track report that shows the rake angle, right? Here's the rake angle again, and anything blue is a rake of 1 degree or more. Then when the rake angle goes down, we are in the green territory, and when it becomes negative, we go to yellowish red. So what we're looking out for now are the negative parts, or the red parts on the track, and not by accident have I put the car on this very spot because it really pronouncedly showed that on turn in or right after turn in into the first quick left corner up on the hill, the car would have a negative rake angle and became understeery all of a sudden. And I wanted to avoid that the car goes so low on the rear, which is why I did the following. Let's go back to the screenshots. And you can't actually see that in the aerodynamic tab, right? Of course it happens when I go so low, but the next change I did then is actually visible in the bump stops that we've seen earlier. Here we see that the bump stop range is quite high, which if you think, well, this is Bathurst, we want to allow the suspension to move and there are quite high curbs and everything, I changed the setup quite drastically, and I can go back and forth a little bit. So on the fronts, you can see I reduced the bump stops quite a lot. So we're riding way off more often on the bump stops, and we do limit the amount the car pitches forward, and all of a sudden the downforce on the front increasing very, very much. So by reducing the bump stops, we limit this movement of the suspension and we have a more stable aerodynamic base, so to say. And usually you don't do this, but in this case it worked, also reducing the rear bump stop range. Let's go back to Motec and show you in the data what I actually meant. So we've actually been looking at the good lap, and let's start looking at the first slower lap. It's not as pronounced as you would think, but if we put it side by side, maybe it becomes more visible. So the red one now is the old setup, the aggressive one, and then we have my changed setup. And for example, here you can see it quite well. There's a point where we have negative rake on the old setup. Now it's gone on the new setup. And here the negative rake on the old setup and the new setup, it's still going quite negative, but not as much, and you can already feel that when the car turns in. And if we can we go even closer? Not so much. Here's still also a kind of red indication, whereas on the new setup there is nothing in regards to that. He was also a little red dot, which isn't there anymore on the new setup. And this was achieved by changing bump stops mainly, and that gave us a more stable aero balance, made the car more predictable, and gave me overall more faith in the car. I wasn't willing to show that. I think we were the damper histogram. So ending the video almost, I will show you the lap now. And I hope you can see by the input that I give how hard I'm on the throttle, how hard I'm on the brakes, how much I'm throwing the car into the corners. You can see the amount of confidence that I now have in the car after making all those setup changes. I of course put it in the description together with those Motec files if you like. Then you can make your own comparisons in the setup and Motec data. I'll also put the replay file for you to review the hot lap. Need to add, by far, this isn't perfect. There's always adjustments you can make, but if you just compare the aggressive setup to my setup, I think you will increase your lap time quite a bit. And having said all that, I will finally stop talking, move into the game, shut down my microphone, and let you enjoy this lap, which, have to say, could be a bit faster still, because I made a mistake you will see in the hairpin. However, the video ends with a lap. Goodbye, thanks for watching, and see you soon.